Good morning, everyone. Boy, you all spread out nicely. I hope you're here for the new test coordinators training for secondary folks today. If you're not, you're welcome to stay. But I'm assuming nobody would really come to this unless they had to. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce my boss, Dr. Frank Gilbert, who is Director of Test Development and Measurement, to give you a welcome.
Good morning, and I would be remiss if I didn't introduce my boss, Dr. Chen An, who is in charge of our whole area. So, number one, I'd like to welcome you as new test coordinators to one of the exciting parts of education. Somewhat underappreciated, perhaps, but the purpose of testing is to provide to the students and the teachers the high-quality feedback that can inform instruction, inform learning, and support good decision-making by everybody involved. The late Grant Wiggins, one of the great educator and assessment people, said, learning is not so much a function of teaching, it's a function of practice with good feedback. And your role is to make sure that that feedback is high quality by maintaining the standardization, maintaining the way that things are administered, maintaining the atmosphere of a high quality assessment and delivery system. We have lots of assessments, as you are well aware, and they are more the same than different, which in some ways makes your job more difficult because you become responsible for those little details that are different about each assessment. What accommodation can I allow with this assessment that I can't allow with this one? How much time does this one take versus how much does this one take? And that's why you have to deal with the details. Now, you're very fortunate that you have some of the very best people to support you in Cindy and Barrington. At the end of the school year, when the state wants to find out, how did we do? This is who they invite to come up and say, these are the things that we need to change. This worked well, but this one, it's a real bummer. Change that. Here are some new ideas of how to do it. These are the people who are the leaders of the state association of the test administrators. So all of those people look to Cindy and Barrington for that kind of leadership. The other thing that is new this year is the solution that the legislature came up with for the ongoing complaint that came from the constituents saying the entire spring of the school year is consumed by testing. They just don't do anything but testing. And so the legislature came up with a solution. And their solution was, we're going to do all the testing in May. So it won't take up the whole spring. It will just take up the whole month of May. And so that means that we're going to have test after test after test for pretty much the whole month of May. So that means two things to you. One, the spring's going to be a little bit easier. But it also means that each test you prepare for has to be a practice, has to fill in a blank, has to build the structure, has to build the skills, has to build the human resources necessary to make May work. Because by the time you get to May, you won't have time to react to anything. Everything will have to be in place and everybody will have to know what to do because you won't possibly be able to answer the questions at that point. So each test is important on its own, and you have to do that. But you also have to think, as you're doing that, build the structures, build the skills, build the support throughout your entire school to make May happen. So Cindy and Barrington will get into the details, and there'll be more of those than you'll be able to deal with. But feel confident and feel comfortable that they are here and they're working with you. So welcome to the world of assessment. I think it's one of the exciting parts of education. I've been doing it for decades. Let's say decades, shall we? And I still get excited about assessments. So welcome and have a good training. Cindy.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to get a couple of caveats. When you get through with this training, you are not going to know everything there is to know about testing. What we're going to do today is to kind of prepare for you and give you kind of a platform on which to stand on. If you're not standing on firm ground and a good set of information, you know, it starts to become like quicksand and you feel like you're going to drown. It's going to be a lot of information. Do not panic. Just kind of take it back, sit with it for a little while, let it kind of sink in. We'll give you some key pointers. We're going to give you some resources, but, you know, don't feel like you're going to walk out of here knowing I'm the greatest test coordinator in the world, or, yeah, I can do this job. You're going to feel kind of overwhelmed. So I just want to prepare you for that, because we get kind of the deer in the headlights at the end of this assessment thinking, oh my God, what did I get myself into? I've been doing this for almost 29 years now. Never lost a test coordinator yet. Okay? I've been in the test field since I started with OCPS back in 1990. Oh, that's scary. So, you know, don't panic. We'll get you through it. So, starting at the line, I wanted to give you a little kind of who we are first. Our organization umbrella is Research, Accountability, and Grants, which is the bottom part. Dr. Jennifer Sasser is our Associate Superintendent. Over that is, and of which Chen An is our Senior Director of Research, Accountability, and Grants. Then under that is Test Development and Measurement, and that Dr. Frank Gilbert is the Director. And then under that is, or on top of that, if you like to speak, is Test Development and Student Assessment. We are broken out into two sections. Some of you may have worked with Casey Libersat and Michelle Paul. They run the Test Development Center and are responsible for creating the common final exams and the PMAs. And we work very closely with them. So, who we are. I am Cindy Landers. Don't call me Cynthia. Only my mom used to call me Cynthia, mostly when she was mad at me. And I handle the Southeast, East, and STO learning communities, alternative ed, charter schools A through O, and high schools A through K. The reason when we first started this, when Barrington came on with me about 5 years ago, we just kind of all handled everything. And what happened is, you wanted to get a quick answer, so you emailed both of us. And what that did was completely bog down our emails. And then we started duplicating our efforts, and we're slower in getting back to you. So what we've done is split it up. If you are in those areas, you would give me a call. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm the only one you can call. If you can't get a hold of me, by all means, you can get a hold of, you can call Barrington or email Barrington. If you like him better, you can call him too. Okay, and then we have Barrington Maxwell, who works right alongside me doing everything I do. He does the Southwest, Northwest, and innovation, along with charter schools, P through Z, high schools, L through Z, and the technical centers when they test. So, and that's how you get a hold of him. Want to make a caveat, if you're emailing Barrington, make sure that you get the junior on the end of Maxwell, the JR. If you don't, his email goes out into the netherworld. You don't get a kickback that it didn't really go where it was supposed to go, and he never gets it. We haven't quite figured out where it does go. But just make sure you get that JR on the end of his. And finally, in the back, you see Jeanette, wave your hand. That's Jeanette Figueroa, without which we could not manage our department. She keeps us straight. You met her when you checked in, and she handles all the user accounts. So if you're having trouble with getting onto one of the platforms, you would give Jeanette a call. If you need additional materials for those few tests we now have that have paper, she basically handles that. And she does myriad of other things that keeps Bear and I out of trouble. If you email her, that is not a mistake. She goes by Jeanette, but her email is thelma.figueroa. And there is a Jeanette Figueroa in the district, so don't get confused by that. You've got to put thelma.figueroa, and it will get to her. Okay, our responsibilities. What we do basically is manage everything to do with testing. We enforce the state statute and the test security rules. We create and provide training, which amounts to about 30 trainings a year for all the different tests. We generally, we sometimes break them out depending on how we're giving them by elementary and then secondary, but we pretty much do this all year long. In addition, we will be doing some call-ins, monthly call-ins this year. We are not doing it this time because we did have these trainings going on, but we're hoping that this helps. The state does a monthly call-in, and what we've done is we're going to schedule it right after that to give you just any new information. There's really no big structure to it other than we will give you anything new, or if we're hearing a lot of questions, the same question over and over again, we'll talk about it because obviously people are confused or don't have that information. And then it's just going to be open for questions. So if you don't feel like you have time to do it, that's perfectly fine. It's just going to be an open format. We will be recording them and posting them. So if you can't get into it, then you can go ahead and listen to it later. We support all of you guys. That is one of our biggest roles in this department, is to support you all. That is our function. So never, never, never feel like, oh my God, I've got to call them again. We will never make you feel stupid for calling or silly or that you should have known that. Don't ever apologize for calling us. That's our function. We want to hear from you. We want you to do it right. With doing state testing, there are ramifications for doing things wrong, okay? It affects school grades. It affects, we're in secondary now, so it affects kids' graduation. We want to make sure you have the information to do it right. So there is no such thing as just a stupid question. There's no such thing as a silly question, and you cannot ask too many questions. So that's one of our main functions, and probably the most important function we do. We communicate with you. You will be getting lots of emails from us. We pretty much get weekly email going out to you, depending on the time of year and what's going on. Because we handle all aspects of the district, state, and also the national test administrations that a few of you may or may not be participating in. We facilitate the reporting. The reports that come back and the scores come first through my office, and then they funnel down into the various departments that handle the reporting and those kinds of things. I will be sending out, or Barrington and I will be sending out an email saying the scores are in and let you know how you can retrieve your school scores. We also collaborate with other departments to meet whatever their assessment needs are.
Got mail.
Okay, email. Again, this is so important that you keep. You're going to get a lot more emails than you ever did. You're going to get questions from within your school. You're going to get stuff from other departments. But please make sure you keep your email clean. If you know that your email was hosed up and, had shut down because it was full, which generally it doesn't do anymore, but please make sure you're double checking it. We do send out lots of emails. All the really important ones we send through student assessments at OCPS.net. It won't come from Cindy or Barrington. It comes from student assessments. That means you better open that up, and it's probably worth saving into an archive because it'll have very specific information about a test. And remember, email one of us. If you don't get an answer within 24 hours, by all means call or email the other one. email is probably the easiest way to get in touch with us, because sometimes, especially when we're in a test mode, the phone rings a lot. If you need an immediate answer, you've got some real emergency, you've got kids testing and nothing's working, you don't know what to do right now, send me an email that says, Cindy or Barrington, call me, I need you right now. We will, as soon as we're off the phone, we will call you. Make sure your phone number or your extension is on that email, and we will give you a call right away. Just a note about emails, when you email us, there is a little handy thing called signatures. Please put your school name and your extension on your signature, and you can set it so it just automatically adds on to your emails when you send out an email. That helps us know who I'm talking to, and if I've talked to you before, because you got to remember, we have 250 different sites that we are supporting. And so it's really hard to, sometimes it takes us a little while to get a name to a school, to a problem. And so do put that on there, and it just helps us get back to you that much faster. Okay, the tests we manage. The FSA, that's the big 50,000-ton gorilla in the room. Florida Standards Assessment, ELA and Math in grades 6 through 10. Statewide assessment in grade 8, the science. FSAA, that is the Florida Standards Alternate Assessment for students that are on access points. Not a lot of kids do this. Some schools may not have any, but you have to be prepared, because if you do get a student during the window that's open, you need to assess that student. So it's very important that you kind of, even though you may not have a unit that brings those kids in, at some point you could get one of those students in your school. So make sure you're at least kind of keeping up to speed on that, even if you don't have kids. Because if all of a sudden a student does enroll in your school during the window, you need to be prepared to assess that student. iReady is only in middle schools. Access for L's, and alternate access for L's for all LY students, all multilingual students. The CFEs are the common final exams in grades 6 through 12. We give that twice a year, once for the first semester and once at the end of the year. And then the national assessments and international assessments that we do. We have NAEP. I have already notified schools if they are participating. So you may want to double check with your principal, but there's only, I want to say about 20 schools participating this year in NAEP. It is a national assessment, and they do it every year. We do not get results from it, but they are results by state, and it will only be a selection of your students if you get picked for that. PEARLS is the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, and then TIMS, which is the Trends in International Math and Science Study. Those are both international studies where students all across the globe participate. And again, it's a very small sample of your school if you do get chosen for those. Okay, for secondary schools, we also manage the FSA EOCs, Algebra 1 and Geometry, the NGSSS EOCs in Civics, Biology, and U.S. History, PERT, the Post-Secondary Educational Readiness Test, which for this point in time is just being used for dual enrollment, and the Algebra 1 Concordance Score. And then we have PSAT SAT School Day, which is coming up very quickly in October. Okay, so here you are at the starting line. First things first. One of the biggest resources you have is our IMS Page. This is where we put all of the resources for you, forms, checklists. It's where we post our the recordings of our trainings. We record all of our trainings. So even if you sat through the training, many times coordinators will go back and oh my goodness, I've got to listen to that again. You can scroll fast through them and kind of find what you're looking for. So they're available to you as a tool. You can see that it's divided into elementary, middle, and high school assessments. And then underneath that, each of the different assessments that you have. And right there you have how to get to it. That is a live link if you download the PowerPoint, which again is also on our IMS page. Okay, navigating our IMS page. At the top of it, you've got the FSA and GSS score inquiry window. That is a live link to our trainings. So when we do a training for that, is that a training?
No,
Or is
that
that-
one was just to let you know about
that's
the
a
window.
deadline.
When we have trainings are posted.
If we have training. So it'll either be a very important deadline coming up, or it will be a training. Okay, and all you have to do is click on it and go. So if you know the training's coming up, you don't have to search through to find Barrington's email or my email about the training to find the link. You just go to the IMS page, pop the link, and you're in. Okay, at that point, what you have are the other resources for this particular test. So you've got the GPO accounts. You also have, and I'm having trouble reading that,
The order forms.
the what?
The order forms.
The order forms, and what's the last one?
The websites.
The websites for those. So, sorry, I'm getting really old, I tell you. So for the GPO accounts, those are something that you will learn about, and when you do the training for the actual test. Those are things that the kids use to log into the system, and it logs them into a secure bubble, so to speak, for that test, so they can't go out and go onto the internet during the test, those kinds of things. It's also set up so that the test hopefully functions very smoothly. There's lots of code behind that to make sure that it goes as smooth as it can. So those are just the things that you need. The order forms, if there is paper involved, that's where you would find the forms to go ahead and order your materials. Even if it's a CBT test, there's usually materials involved. You've got manuals, you've got work folders, lots of different stuff that you might be ordering for that. Okay. Then we have the calendar. Now, I'll show you where the big calendar for everything lies, but this will always be the calendar for the particular test you're in at that point. If you've gone into, a particular test, it will just have the test dates for that test. When you go down there, that's where you're going to find our PowerPoints and the recordings of our either Safari Montage Live or this recording, a live recording of the training. Okay? At that point, you've got resources. This is where you would see forms, additional forms, checklists, things like that that you might need for this particular test. The next one is parent communication. This is the one where we store the parent letters. For most tests, you are responsible for sending out information to the parent about the particular test. Now, we do give those. We try to give them in as many languages as we can. We usually get them in English, Spanish, Haitian Creole, and we usually get those from Dade County, who does a fabulous job of translating things. And we do share them on districts. Occasionally, we will get them in some of the other languages, but those are the three that we almost always get them in. It's not necessary that you send out the exact letter, but you could take that letter and put it into in your newsletter, if you have a school newsletter that goes out. It's usually good to do it at least once or twice. Well, you have to do it once. But if you do the newsletter and then take bullets out from it, that's fine. So, but you do have those to give out each time, and that's where you find those. Okay, the navigation pane. This is an important one. This actually sits on the right-hand side of every page you go out to on the IMS. There is information about the test calendar. Now, a word about the test calendar. You see that there's one for elementary, middle, and high, and it's pretty and colorful and very easy to read. We do not share this calendar with the public. There is one called the Uniform State Assessment Calendar. That will be out on the website probably in another week or two, maybe 3 weeks. We expect that. It's going through the process right now of approval. That is the only one that can be shared with parents as a test calendar. You can't give them the one that sits up here. You can share with them specific dates. Okay, so you can pull the dates out and give those to the calendar. It's basically state rules that we're following. The state uniform assessment calendar is about 13 pages. Is that right? It's about 13 pages, and it's huge. It's got a lot of information, most of which parents really couldn't care less about. It's a little bit unwieldy to use. Ours is much more user-friendly, but we have to follow state rules. And so if a parent requests the calendar, you point them to that uniform calendar. You can give them the dates off the other one if they just want the dates of Algebra 1. You can certainly share with them just the dates.
I also want to point out that the calendars that she's referring to will always have the word draft across it.
Right.
Even though we're not making any changes to it, it's pretty much set in stone at this point. It will always say draft because it is subject to change and because we cannot post it publicly.
Right. Usually at the beginning of, it depends on the year. Sometimes there's more going on and they might change the dates, and it has happened. I don't really expect it this year, but again, we're at the whim of the state. Then you have general resources on there, like the CFE outlines and some other just general resources you may need. Then you've got the general training information. We have on there the information about the security courses, which every person who is going to have anything to do with the testing has to go through. At this point, just the one for employees is up, but I think in another...
By the end of September.
By the end of September, there will be one for non-employees. So if you do have some parent volunteers that you want to use in the spring, if you have some subs that need to take it, they can also take that when it becomes live for that. And then you have our contact information. If you don't have it already on speed dial, you can always go there to the IMS page, and that is always on the right-hand side of any page you are on. That's a constant. Okay, common terms and isms. We love alphabet soup in education. PBT is paper-based test. CBT, computer-based test. Long Wednesday. There's always a lot of information or people wanting what are the long Wednesdays. When we do the master calendar, anytime there's a major test that is going to be given on a Wednesday, we extend that Wednesday to a regular day to make sure that kids who need extended time get their extended time in the full day for extended time. Now, for this coming October, we have one on October 10th for the PSAT and SAT school day. Well, that doesn't really involve elementary. But when you extend the day, that means the whole bus schedule has to shift, which means everybody has to do the extended Wednesday. Okay, that's why. Some parents get really, well, wait a minute, that's the high schools are doing that. Why do we have to extend? And that is why, because it affects the bus system. And you can't just change the high schools, you got to change the whole schmear. Okay? MSID school number, that is your 4-digit school number, your location number, It's the number that you're tied to for personnel, for paychecks, for everything. It's the same number. SML, Safari Montage Live, that is what we use for our web-based trainings, which most of them will be. We give those, we try not to do live trainings too much. We wanted to be able to see you, for you to see us and get to know us as new test coordinators, but we try to keep you in the school as much as we can. We used to do all of our trainings live, but we know that that's hardship. How many of you all drove more than 45 minutes to get here? Okay, quite a few of you. And we try not to do that. There will be a live training for the big FSA, because we'll be giving lots of information and we want to make sure there's lots of time for questions back and forth. But almost all the others are going to be on Safari Montage. NR codes. You probably have heard this. Excuse me. If you haven't, NR codes are used to identify why a test score was not released. I'm not going to go into this too much, but there are several reasons why the state might not release a score. And this is on the rosters that you get. So that's one of the first places you go if you're missing a score, is to go back to those rosters and see what was the reason the score was not released. Transfer folder. This is an important one. Every school has a transfer folder. Actually, every location has a transfer folder. We have a transfer folder. Personnel has a transfer folder. What this is a secure spot on our servers that we can place information or files for a school to get. So we're not shooting them through email or any other method or faxing them. We can actually place an entire folder into your transfer folder. Now, the only folks that have access to that transfer folder are your principal and maybe some APs. You need to, if we call you and tell you that we've placed a file in your transfer folder, you need to contact your principal to get a hold and ask them to please put that folder somewhere where you can get it. Okay? We do this with anything that is large or has an enormous amount of information. We often will give you lists of kids that may be testing. We might give you lists of kids with their scores. Your PreID list, which is the next one up. Every time we do a test, we go through a process called PreID. I work with the ITS department, and we pull a file with all of the kids that fit the parameters for that particular test. Once that's done, I upload it onto the particular vendor that has that test. And then that way, when you go into that particular platform, whether it be Tide, Pearson, iReady, those kids are already there for you to look at. Now, pre-IDs are not perfect, and we'll talk about them a little bit later, but I wanted you to know what that pre-ID means. It's a file that we do. You guys do not pre-ID, so sometimes you'll see it in the manuals. That's our responsibility. Okay, so let's talk about you guys and what you need to get this job done. Test coordinator. I don't know how he spelled that, but that's how it's pronounced. A person who manages, plans, facilitates standardized testing at your work location. An expert in multitasking. You need to be a collaborator. And my favorite, convincing other people to do things they don't really want to do, which somebody did to you when you became test coordinator, I suspect. How many of you volunteered for this job? Holy cow, I love it. You guys get gold stars. I think that's the first time I've ever had hands go up. I love it. Kudos to you. But you need to be a multitasking ninja. Now, that is not necessarily all year, but there will be times when you feel like you're ready to pull your hair out. That's okay. We're going to get you through this. You need to be a leader. Teachers are going to look to you. And what happens as a leader? Sometimes you need to make tough decisions. They are always going to be real popular with some of the teachers. You support the school's improvement plan. You supervise everything to do with student assessments. If we are the gods and goddesses of assessment in OCPS, you guys are the gods and goddesses of assessment in your school. Not your principal, not your teachers, not anybody else who may have been doing testing for 30 years. I love teachers that say that I've been doing this for 30 years. I don't need to go to training. Yes, they do, and you're going to tell them that. So just know that you have the best, most current information about testing of anybody else in your school. Even the principals don't get the information that you do about assessment. So know that and own it. You need to have some good organizational skills. So if you know that you're not a terribly organized person, which when I started this, I was not. It's not in my nature to be super, uber organized. But I've learned it. It is a very learnable skill. Doesn't always bleed over into every other part of my life. You can look at my desk in my house and know that. But you can learn it. You collaborate and delegate. You can't do this by yourself. You are going to need help from other departments. When we get to May, as Frank alluded to, it's going to be all hands on deck. They may not be managing it, but everybody has to participate. And you have to have a year's supply of patience. You're going to need patience and a lot of it. Okay. Plan for testing, manage testing after testing. And I will tell you, the plan for testing is going to take up 80% of your time. And with that, I think this is where I'm going to turn it over to Bear.
Thank you, Cindy. So we're going to talk about setting a plan so that you can get testing done. So of course, you need to know where to start. You need to know when to test, who needs to test in terms of the population of students that need to be included, where they should test, whether it's going to be in the classroom, in the computer lab. Being that most of you here are at the middle schools and high schools, you are now one-to-one. So good job and kudos to you. That makes life so much easier. But there may be times when you may have to commandeer the gym, which we really don't like, or the cafeteria to get testing done. What materials are needed for testing? And then, of course, there's so many other things that are involved, but we're just going to touch on the main points. So, of course, we talked about the test calendar, and Cindy pointed out where they are. So that's always the first place you want to look. For those of you at the middle schools, elementaries, K-8s, high schools, we have determined the days that you will be testing. In the past, schools used to have a window, and you could test pretty much any days within that window. Because of paper-based testing for your sixth graders, for those of you at the middle schools and K-8s, the state has mandated what days those tests can be administered. And then, because you are one-to-one with devices, we have also decided, hey, you guys can test everyone on this day. The reason why we do that is because it helps everyone get tested, the most amount of students at the same time. When it's spread out over days, it's more intrusive on your school schedule. And then, of course, with you being one-to-one, testing is done all on one day. You can move back on to continuing instruction with your students. As we talked about before, the test calendar is always subject to change. Throughout the year, we recommend that you go through and any copies that you have, you destroy those and print new copies. There are times when small, minor changes might be made. When we are making changes, we do try to inform you in advance, but just remember to always go through and print a new copy from time to time. All right, so let's take a quick quiz. I know one person, well, actually probably about two of you have probably seen this quiz already, so no helping out. Where is the preliminary test calendar found? Is it A, on the OCPS main website, on the student assessment IMS page, C, the preliminary calendar is no longer available, or D, on the OCPS intranet site? All right, yes, it's on the student assessment IMS page. So of course, here's an example of that calendar. As we mentioned before, we have one for elementary, middle, and high. We never did one for K-8s, and I don't really know why. I guess I'm to blame for that. Maybe next year we'll do a K-8 calendar as well for those of you at the K-8 sites. I want to point out that on the calendars, we tell you the specific dates on which you're going to be testing. We also let you know what the makeup window is. We tell you the format, if it's going to be paper-based or computer-based, and then generally the population of students that will be involved in testing. Who to test. Of course, now you know the dates of when you're going to be testing. Now you need to know who needs to take the actual test. Now, in most cases, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th, 10th, etc., generally there are tests, FSA, that are based simply on the grade levels that those students are enrolled in. There are other cases where the courses determine which tests a kid will take. Those are your end of course exams, your AP tests, if you have the awesome opportunity to be the AP coordinator at your school as well. And then of course our common final exams. And then we have tests that are based off of a student's English proficiency. That's our Access for L's assessment. And then you have your FSAA, which is based off of a student's cognitive ability. Another thing, especially if you're at a high school, that you need to take into account regarding which assessments students need to take would be their 9th grade cohort. For example, PERT is a good example of this one. Currently, for PERT, 9th graders can take PERT for dual enrollment and dual enrollment only. Students in 10th, 11th, and 12th can take it for dual enrollment and Algebra 1 concordant, all right? So you always want to make sure that you get with your guidance counselors. They are the expert on cohorts, 9th grade cohorts, and the tests that those students need to take. So we talked about the PreID file. The PreID file is designed to capture the greatest number of kids that need to actually test. Now, of course, Cindy mentioned it's not perfect. For example, when we do a PreID, there are some nuances that we can't pull in terms of the data that we have. So, for example, let's say we're pulling students for Algebra 1, right? There may be kids in your school who are in Algebra 1 and taking an additional math course. They may be taking Algebra 1 just for that half semester to make up a course, but depending on when they're enrolled, we may pull them as well for the test, even though they may have already taken it and passed the EOC, and they're just making up a semester. So a student in that case would not need to take the EOC again unless they were taking the entire course. So there may be some kids included in the PreID file that don't need to test. Your job is to make sure that the kids that you know need to test are included, and any kids that are not included, you therefore go ahead and add in by hand. Here are some ways to find students that you need to test. There's EDW, Access Student, SMS, and baseball card. Next year, we'll probably be removing SMS and adding Skyward to this list. Now, with these platforms, none of them are really one-stop shops for pulling everything that you need, unfortunately. When I was test coordinator, there were times when I would have to pull 3 and 4 different files and combine them together to get the one that I need. Things are a little bit easier for you now with the way that we've organized some of the platforms, but you will need to probably pull one file and then convert some of the information to another document to get what you need. So instead of doing about 3 or 4 different files, you may just need to do 2 files to make one. Microsoft Excel. If you've never opened this application before on your computer, I guarantee you before the end of next week, you probably will need to be familiar with Microsoft Excel. If you're crazy like me, Microsoft Excel is probably one of your favorite applications. I like to create files and reports and all that good fun stuff. And Frank knows that, so he gives me special projects. And I like to whip out pivot tables, but you don't have to worry about that. But you will need to know that Excel is going to be your friend. One thing that I will guarantee will be the best thing that will help you in learning Excel, if you don't already know Excel, is searching for things on Google. Simple searches, how do I filter something in Excel? Simple stuff like that will pull up what you are looking for. There are tons of resources. I promise I haven't found a resource that has not been helpful by searching on Google. This is why Excel is going to be your friend: sorting and filtering. There are many cases in which you'll need to sort or filter students out. It's something that most people seem to find, I don't say difficulty with, but they're not really familiar with how to actually accomplish it. This is just a quick little video that shows how to sort and how to filter in Excel. When we post this to the website, it will be available for you to look at. And then, of course, if you ever have questions, I am no Excel expert, but if you have questions, you can call Cindy or myself, and we'll do our best to help you. Enterprise Data Warehouse. This is EDW. If you don't have access to EDW today, then you need to nag your principal to get, or API, to get access to EDW. EDW will change your life. It does take some time to get access, especially during the beginning of the year. And the reason why that is because so many people are coming into new positions and need access to EDW. This is where they have tons and tons of reports. When we are loading files from the vendors, they have to pass through EDW in order to get to baseball card and SMS. So everything basically is in EDW, generally in ways that you can use it. There are some times when it's not so helpful, but for the most part, EDW is where you want to look. To access EDW, the website is listed there, and you will use your OCPS network credentials. So the same username you use to access your email is the same credentials you'll use to access EDW. There are dashboards set up in EDW, so when you log in for the first time, most of your page will be blank, but if you click on dashboards, you'll see all the available dashboards that are there. The one that you'll probably be using most often is the K-12 dashboard. The K-12 dashboard is where information that is specific to schools are located. Access Student. Access Student is a dashboard inside of EDW. When I was test coordinator way back when, Access Student was its own separate database that you had to access to find reports. The main thing that Access Student is useful for is your student schedules. So for example, in Access Student, you can go in and pull down a spreadsheet with the schedules of all of the students at your school. Why is this helpful? When you need to figure out where kids are first period, let's say you're passing out parent letters through their first period teachers, you know which teachers' mailboxes those letters need to go into. The other thing is, let's say you need to figure out who is enrolled in geometry. You can go into Access Student, look at the schedules, pull it by course, and see all the kids that are enrolled in geometry. Make sure you pull geometry and geometry honors so that you can have everybody that's enrolled in that course. SMS. Generally speaking, I don't like using, and this is Barrington speaking personally, I don't like pulling reports from SMS. However, SMS has tons of useful information. Generally speaking, when you're pulling stuff from SMS, it's usually on a student-by-student basis. If you like SMS reports, by all means, go ahead and use them. But there are reports in there, but as I mentioned before, the data that's in EDW, it has to go through EDW to make it to SMS. Keep in mind that your credentials for SMS are not your OCPS network credentials. Because it's not on the interface, when you create a password for SMS, it stays the same until you change it at some point in time. But the same password I've had for SMS back in 2008 when I first got to OCPS is still the same one. The FLE ID. Some of you probably have heard about the FLE ID. It is a 14-digit number that is very difficult to memorize, but if you can memorize them for your students, good job. The state requires us to use the FLE ID now for testing. So any tests that we do that are state tests, instead of using the student's 10-digit student ID number, we have to use the FLE ID. There are cases when students don't have a FLE ID number. The person you want to check is your registrar. He or she is the person that will get with student enrollment to make sure that a student has a FLE ID. Yes, Shanta. The FLE, oh, good question. The FLE IDs are not in EDW, all right? Even though, like I said, everything that passes through EDW is an SMS, the FLE ID is not included on many of the reports. The reason why that is because when they created these reports in EDW back in the day, well, not that long ago, but when they created them, the FLE ID did not exist. We just started using FLE IDs last school year, and that is why many reports don't have them. So we're going to talk about a VLOOKUP in just a second. And basically, if you're pulling a report from EDW, what you want to do is match the student ID number to the FLE ID number, which you can pull from like baseball card.
And I know that when you are in the middle of testing and you've got lots of people waiting for things and you need that FLE ID, please do not either make it up, 0000, and putting FL and the 4800 number, that doesn't include the FLE ID either. Because what you're doing is setting yourself up for a bigger headache down the road, trying to get that score tied back to that kid. Yep. So I know it's when you're in a panic, that's your first, and I might have done it too back in the day, but don't do it when you really do cause yourself further headaches down the road.
Yes, because what happens is the FLE ID number is tied to a student's account through their entire career as a student. So if you go in and create or make up one, it probably belongs to another student, and it creates havoc, all right? It creates havoc. You cannot search for a student's FLE ID number by typing it in SMS. However, if you go under federal info, scroll all the way down to the bottom, I think they're trying to hide it from you guys, you'll find the FLE ID down there. If you pull up a student's FLE ID number and it's just FL and zeros all the way across, that means the student does not currently have a FLE ID, so contact your registrar. The next one is baseball card. Baseball card is one of the platforms inside of Unify. It has tons of reports that are very colorful. You can pull the reports and download them as an Excel spreadsheet, which will make your life so much easier. When you're logging in, make sure that you're accessing it using your OCPS credentials. And the baseball card, one of the neat things is that you can add a column header, which will therefore display the FLE IDs for your students so that you can see what their FLE ID numbers are. So if you ever want to have just a roster of FLE IDs, you can actually go into the baseball card, add the header for FLE ID, and you will have FLE IDs for every student at your school. And here's VLOOKUP. So of course, talking about VLOOKUP in concept, it can be a little challenging to understand and comprehend, but essentially what VLOOKUP allows you to do is it allows you to compare and pull information from one document and move it into another document. Of course, this is used in Excel. We have the link here that has support for doing the VLOOKUP. And here, this kind of tells you what information goes in the fields when you're trying to figure out the formula for VLOOKUP. The lookup value is the cell that has the data that you want to look up for as a match. This is generally going to be your PreID number or the SID, depending on which way you're going with your report. The table array is the table that you want to take the information from. The column index number is the number of the column where this information needs to be taken from. And the range lookup. Do you want a close match or do you want a near match? When dealing with student ID numbers, you always want to use an exact match. But like I said, you have to try it out for it to make sense. I know I'm just talking about terms now, but if you have this handy when you try it out, I promise you'll have success. If you have issues, I was going to say call Google, but no, you can call me and I can help you with it as well. Now, the reason why we went through all of those platforms is because ultimately you will need to create rosters of students that need to test, whether it's for the purpose of attendance or in notifying teachers where students will need to test. You will need to create a roster. What we've done here is we've shown you some of the headings that are helpful when creating rosters, especially for testing. You want to make sure that the student ID number or PreID number is included. Of course, the first and last name, date of birth, ethnicity, gender, whether or not they're ELL or ESC. Generally, that is found on your reports in EDW. And then, of course, you'll want to know what dates are going to be testing, the time, and the location. If you're doing rosters for mail merges for, like, for example, parent letters, one of the things that was very helpful for me in the past is I will pull the student schedule roster, and then I'd use a mail merge and just add the student's first and last name, teacher, and class period when I was doing the parent letters. Then I would then print them out according to teachers, and when I took them off the copiers, I could just place them in the teacher mailboxes, and it already had the kid's period and their name on the actual letter. So that's something you can do for here. And this header that's below shows you the fields that were included for that. Because you are the boss of testing, you get to determine the schedule of which students will test. So of course, as we mentioned before, pretty much everyone is going to test on the same day. But you'll need to know that you need to schedule kids for a particular classroom or lab on campus. Depending on the size of the population of kids, you may probably be moving or displacing teachers from one building to another so that everybody can test in the same building. I know that at high schools, this doesn't always work out in terms of the way your buildings are, because you may have all English on one floor and all science on one floor, or you may have everybody just kind of mixed in. So you may have to move some teachers around so that you can lock down a building for testing. Middle schools, you tend to be a little bit easier. Well, I assume. I haven't been to middle school in a few years, but generally they're by teams and by grade levels. So therefore you have all your 8th grade teachers together, all your 7th grade and 6th grade teachers together. Here's an example of a roster. It shows the kids and their student ID numbers, where they're going to be testing, and the locations that they'll be testing. You want to make sure that when you're choosing locations for testing, that they are environments conducive to testing. For example, you don't want to test in a room next to the kitchen where pans and pots could be clinging while kids are testing, which is why we generally try not to have testing in the cafeteria. But of course, again, you guys get to determine where you're going to be testing. Auditoriums generally are not great places for testing. Usually because it's hard to access students. Most auditoriums have long rows, so it's hard to get to kids during testing. And then, of course, the lighting may not always be the best for that situation. If you're going to be testing in labs, then make sure that you have looked at the rooms in advance so that you know what to expect for your testing environments. Because most of you are one-to-one at this point. Generally speaking, you will be testing in classrooms. You want to make sure that there's ample space to test those students. You can spread them out. You don't want to have them bunched up so that they can see each other's computers. Any posters that will be helpful, you want to make sure those are covered up so that they're not an aid to students while testing. That will be a breach in test security, a problem for you, and a problem for your school. You want to make sure your teachers are erasing their boards. They don't need to have bell work on the board that day because kids are going to be testing, that kind of thing. If you're going to be testing on computers, you want to obviously you will be testing on computers. If you're going to be testing on a table, you want to make sure that there's ample space for students. We also recommend putting dividers in between the students that are testing at tables. You want to make sure that the desks are arranged so that students are always facing the same direction. You don't want to have kids facing each other while they are testing. Now, we know that I want to say this was at Southwest Middle, when I did some testing over there, they had these desks, that had these tall borders in front of them. So essentially the kids were kind of like in a little cubicle. Now, something like that you could use because the kids can't see each other over the wall or divider, so to speak. So in a situation like that, you could use that. But generally speaking, all the kids need to be facing the same direction for testing. In some cases, some of you may still have labs. Generally, you might be using labs for kids who either forgot to charge their devices or may have issues with their devices, so you move them to a lab. So you want to make sure that the lab is set up and appropriate for testing as well. Of course, make sure you have dividers up in those labs, as you stated before. And then you always want to make sure that you leave an extra computer in the labs vacant in case you have an issue with one of the computers. You can move a student to a new computer. Another thing to take into consideration is how much time is needed. At the middle school and high school levels, generally kids are changing classes. You have class periods, you have passing times, that kind of thing. So take into consideration how long will it take the kids to get to the room for testing? How long will it take to get them situated, have them put their bags away, that kind of thing. Will you need to make any changes to the school bell schedule, or will the testing times fit right on in? For example, most testing sessions are approximately 90 minutes. So if you have class periods that are 48 minutes each, then generally speaking, you can take first and second period and fit that 90 minutes in there. I know that sometimes works, but there are times when it doesn't, when you have your longer tests. For example, when you have PSAT and or SAT school day, those testing times vary. So even though you're running 3 different tests on campus that same day, just keep in mind how that timing is going to affect your entire school. Bell schedule changes. Now, of course, most people don't like change. So the minute you even mention changing the bell schedule, you're probably going to hear some groans. But you are the testing coordinator, so make sure that you discuss with your principal why this is necessary. Most principals, believe it or not, in some time or another, were test coordinators, so they kind of have an idea as to why the schedule needs to be changed. When making decisions about the schedule, you want to make sure that you try to cause as little disruption as possible. Sometimes it's inevitable, but if you can only disrupt 1 class period as opposed to 2 class periods, then try to stick with that. As you're considering bell schedule changes, one of the things that I want to implore you to do is to consider equity, all right? Teachers like equity. So let's say you're having to skip first and second period one day because of a bell schedule change. If you can make up for it the next day by adding some extra time to first and second period the next day, teachers will like you for that. Now, of course, sometimes it's impossible depending on what testing is going on, but especially like with your CFEs and so forth like that, if you're skipping a class period or if you're adding extra class period time, try to make it equitable across all the class periods, because teachers are going to complain and say, well, first period had 90 minutes and now third period has 20 minutes, that kind of thing. So try to make the class periods even. Feedback. Try to make 2 versions of your schedule changes and present them to your stakeholders so that you can get some of their feedback. When you include people, they feel involved and they're more apt to going along with your change. They may not like it, but because they felt included, they will help you out as well. Now, of course, sometimes you may not hear the feedback that you want. Everyone isn't going to be for the changes you're making. That will happen. You'll have to handle it. I always say you get more flies with honey, and it works, trust me. Deb can tell you. Communicate. As soon as you know that you need to change the bell schedule and your principal has approved it, make sure you get the word out. The more time that your teachers can prepare for the schedule change, the better. When you do stuff last minute, then they get angry. And of course, you don't want to have angry teachers with you when you're trying to get testing done, because you need their help to pull it off. Here are some examples of schedule changes. This one here basically breaks down for testing, and it shows a school that has 2 lunch shifts. I know that some schools have 3 lunch shifts, so some finagling would have to be done, but just here's an example of some scheduling that had to be changed to accommodate testing. And then the next one is a schedule that was done for CFEs. I know it's hard to see from where you are sitting. However, there are 3 days of testing, and it goes for periods 1 through 7, and it basically gives equal time for each test session, and it does a good job of allowing teachers that time back that they missed because of the schedule. The 3 columns are for each grade level. So grade 6, grade 7, and grade 8 have different class schedules based off of their lunches, of course. But the testing times and the time periods for classes are the same across the band. All right. And with that, we're going to give you guys a 10-minute break. It is now 9:08. So we'll see you in 10 minutes.